Lundy, and you're watching the Hunter Lundy for the People podcast. In each episode, I engage in meaningful conversations with influential personalities spanning across government, faith, education, sports, and beyond. Together, we dive into some of society's most pressing topics, actively seeking faith-based solutions that empower our community. To support the podcast and subscribe with hunterlundy.com and follow us at Hunter W. Lundy on all social media. I want to thank you for our sponsors. God bless. I want to welcome the audience today to Hunter Lundy for the People. You know, we've been doing this podcast for some time now, and we've focused on issues of faith and science and politics, and really believe that it's these events like this and these interviews like this are necessary for the information to get to the public about what's really happening and what people really need to know and understand, especially during an election cycle like we're in right now. It was only a few weeks ago that I was on a flight out of Gulfport, Mississippi, heading to Missouri, when I sat next to a really kind lady named Elise Goldberg. And in that conversation, and I always believe that God has divine appointments for us, but we had one that day, and she told me who she was, and she told me that she had a son that worked for Homeland Security, but that she was married to a very famous, well-respected pediatrician in America named Dr. Michael Goldberg. And then we had a conversation about a book that he had written that's made an impact around the country, and the book is called The Myth of Autism. And I told her that I had been friends with Bobby Kennedy, and I had hosted a television show called Standing for Justice, and I'd had Robert Kennedy Jr. on the show 2 or 3 times, really addressing healthcare issues since he'd been the founder and CEO of Children's Health Defense over the years, and today he's part of the campaign to elect President Donald Trump, re-elect him. And so we got to have this conversation. And Elise was very informative, and I learned that she co-authored this book. And I said, well, you know, I would like to have Dr. Goldberg on this podcast. I think people really need. Autism has always been something that has made me think and pray for people and what was going on in America. And I know that after talking to Bobby Kennedy, we had discussions about where the statistics had changed, because of both of us are of the same age, and that when we were born in 1954, that maybe there was 1 in 10 with autism, and today, you know, we see, I don't know, an astronomical number of people diagnosed. And I say 1 in 10, I meant 1 in 10,000 born in 1954 with autism, and today it's like 1 in 20 males are diagnosed with autism when they're born. And so I looked into the book, and I want to show this book to the audience, and you can start taking notes on it, The Myth of Autism, and it's co-authored by both Dr. Michael Goldberg and his wife Elise Goldberg, and the foreword is by Dr. Ishmael Mina. And so I'm going to start by introducing Dr. Goldberg and telling the audience, if you listen closely, that he was born in 1946 in Chicago. He's not only a renowned pediatrician and researcher in neuroimmune dysfunction syndromes, NIDS. He graduated from UCLA Medical School in '72, completed his pediatric internship and residency at LAC USC Medical Center, and he's been in private practice in San Fernando Valley, 1975. Not often do we find great clinicians like Dr. Goldberg, but we have found both a great clinician and a great scientist and a great research scientist. So when you get 2 in 1, the medical community and the population gets a real benefit. And so since the early 60s, he specialized in treating immune dysregulation and neurocognitive disorders, and focusing on chronic fatigue syndrome in both children and adults. So he's had this long, illustrative career. He's authored many books and contributed to many numerical, academic, and medical publications. But the one that I really want to talk to, and he's done a lot of development on the neurospec findings, which are very helpful, and he's going to talk about this today. I do want to hush up and give it to Dr. Goldberg, because he's the reason we're here today, to hear from him But I'm going to start, Dr. Goldberg, with your book by the questions, and I thank you for the kind note that you wrote to me when you sent me the note, and saying with good science, medical logic, and this intervention, this health crisis for families and their children can be solved. And that's what we want. I mean, I'm so grateful to all the nonprofits. We have many in our community that are helping children with autism, but we need to diagnose it at an early stage and stop the problems that we've seen and the influx of the pharmaceutical community trying to medicate, regulate, change all these problems that really, many of them don't exist. So with that, here's the questions that you posed in the book, and I want you to take them and tell the audience one by one. Autism is not psychological or developmental, but it's a medical disease. Autism is caused by dysfunction in the neuroimmune system and often by secondary neurotopic viruses that impact the neuroimmune system and brain. Third, illnesses such as autism, ADD and ADHD, and chronic fatigue syndrome all have different labels, but are actually variations on the same thing, neuroimmune dysfunction syndromes. That's the NIDS. That's what the NIDS acronym stands for. A neurospec scan is a diagnostic tool which, used in combination with proven therapies and treatments described in this book, is saving lives today while opening the door to new therapies. What you can do to transform your own life or the lives of your loved ones. Now I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Goldberg. I want to hear your explanations of these questions and what people can look forward to when they read your book. And thank you for what you've done in your service to the medical community and to the population. I know it's been more in the California population than the rest of the country, but I'm pretty sure there's people from all over the country that have come to you for diagnosis.
Hunter, I want to thank you immensely for that very kind introduction. And I will actually say that almost everything I say goes back to my thankfully having the privilege of training in that time an excellent medical system. UCLA was a great medical school. I was taught basic science, and everything I'm about to say today, I have textbooks that still have that basic science. Unless there's been objective, what we call peer-reviewed articles to cancel that out, it's all part of the sad mistake, and you touched exactly on the right situation. How can we have something called autism, 1 or 2 children per 10,000, and I was literally told in medical school, if I saw more than 1 child like that in my lifetime in practice, it was going to be 1 too many. Now, at this time, I have an entire practice of special needs children, and most pediatricians have 10 or 12 of these children in their practice, and the starting point, thankfully, is it's not really autism. This is the reason it has not been solved in all these years. If you go back to the 50s or 60s, a Dr. Kanner and a psychiatrist in Europe were the ones that had invented this new idea called autism. What were the criteria? Per Dr. Kanner, a child was never normal. And that's a very important point. That child was never in our world, never able to interact correctly. They made foolish mistakes, blamed refrigerator mothers. But the truth is that was why it was thought to be neurodevelopmental, never normal. The other point, when it seems to be completely forgotten, when Dr. Kanner was literally asked by the media over and over and over what separated a child with this new idea of autism from basically childhood schizophrenia, it was all considered psychological. The answer was the child with autism was never affectionate. If we just go back to that criteria, 99% of these children do not have real autism. And lastly, I have to throw this in. Graduating medical school, we would make jokes. Half the psychiatrists should get thrown in the ocean, but the other half we needed. And I have to respect that system, that if you look at articles by Dr. Canner, psychiatrists in those days, massive key point. If there was organic illness, you could not get a label called autism. What that means is if a child has a seizure, if a child has motor issues, that's not coming from a psychological idea, it's coming from something medical. And at least the psychiatrist then admitted that. So where have we gone astray? For me, thankful for that background clinically, it was kind of an evolution, beginning with my wife, developing at that time mysterious illness, went to good doctors, I had plenty of access for care. Finally, after no answers, I'll never forget my son saying to me, "Dad, you better fix Mom." And from that became a journey. And I can say, attending conferences over decades now, chronic fatigue syndrome was the start of the NIH CDC making up labels that did not exist in medical school. And as I've tried to explain to families, they created a target you could never define or answer. But what did come out of many conferences, many good research meetings, was ideas of immune dysfunction and viruses. As I put this together clinically, to my complete shock, children I started seeing come in with this new idea of ASD, autism, had blood markers much like my wife. And I can remember shaking my head. What in life did idea of autism have to do with immune dysfunction? As it turns out, I'll repeat many times, what we're calling autism today has nothing to do with what is real autism. In fact, my frustration has been very obvious over the years. When I went and spoke to a very high-powered pediatric professor, these are the professors that don't know what's going on in the autistic world, gives me encouragement there are good people out there. And when I spoke to him, I teased families, it did not take me 2 hours or 2 days. In less than 20 minutes, he said the medical truth. We're talking today about an ASD phenotype in these children. That means an underlying medical illness that is presenting with some autistic symptoms. And over many decades now, that's the only position that makes sense. And I can tell you, first putting it together clinically, and then when I got the privilege of working with Dr. Ismail Mina, Dr. Bruce Miller at Harvard General Hospital, introduced to the early days of neurospec, everything was explainable. I'll never forget Dr. Miller taking at that time 33 scans on children, able to literally shuffle them like a deck of cards, mild, moderate, severe, and never meeting those children, able to tell me everything that was working, not working in those kids. Now, my frustrations have been, we are condemning, at this point, millions of children to no future. This has happened in other disorders too, including ADHD and so on, and they're not using scanning technology that might help us be able to objectify what is really going on. I will take that one big step further. One of the biggest labels out there beside ASD is something called ADHD. And constantly I go back to my medical school training. If I was taught at that time what we called ADD, was essentially a hyperactive, hyperkinetic child who the joke was if they were in their seat, they were brilliant. That's not these ADHD children today. Many of them have soft medical signs. And the key point, if you do neurospec scans on them, they don't have a healthy, normal brain. Those hyper kids were, in theory, normal and had hyperness in basically the frontal lobes of the brain. Most of the ADHD children have some component of temporal lobe hypoperfusion, that's decreased function, and scaringly, if you give them stimulant meds, we're giving Ritalin out like it's candy to children and adults, and the data says it may be dumbing down those temporal lobes. It shuts down parts of the brain. And unfortunately, I go back to excellent professors in medical school who taught me, we don't know why Ritalin works on these hyperactive children, but it does. But I'll never forget the lectures. You would never give it to teenagers or adults because it's habit forming and not good long term. So when I say this system is making many mistakes, we are going against what I consider still excellent training and doing things I was told we should not be doing.
So explain to me, so if you have this child with this temporal lobe issue and the neurospect, the scanning device can detect that. So what is the treatment for that child other than somebody deciding they want to medicate them? And I've always thought Ritalin was like a form of speed, that it changed the way.
It is. It's like cocaine. Exactly. It's no different.
So tell me what the treatment would be for a child that the neurospec shows that they have something that's different, and then it explains why they have these symptoms that the medical community historically just wants to label as autism or ADHD or ADD or whatever they want to label it.
Well, to understand it, one of the things that happened was I actually attended a 1992 NIH-sponsored meeting on chronic fatigue syndrome that I actually believed they were going to make progress. Sadly, they did not. At that conference, they admitted what I had been taught. Everybody walking around has what's called this neuroimmune system. The example is if you get a cold, we'll feel zony, we'll feel spacey, but a cold is a virus that can't go to the brain. So why does that happen? And as they argue, we were designed intelligently. Your body is under threat. You literally shut down blood flow to what are key parts of your brain, your temporal lobe, part of your limbic system, maybe part of the basal ganglia there. But then when we get healthy 4 or 5 days later, it opens back up. At this 1992 NIH meeting, they basically admitted the correct science. They were talking about adults, but take a combination of stresses. It could be a medical illness, it could be a accident, it could be a surgery, it could be psychological, but you put enough stresses on this neuroimmune system and it goes into an autoimmune shutdown and stays shut down. The neurospec confirmed that, and when I talk to parents, they can acknowledge that somewhere along the line, their bright, alert, sparkly, healthy baby becomes disconnected and dull. That is not occurring, unfortunately, for any other biomed reasons people hear. It is occurring because of a medical problem and the body trying to protect parts of the brain. Now, once the neurospec scan confirmed that, it also started to fit into my medical training. You have to always look at why. And I'll say strongly, where I can talk to other doctors, discuss my textbook trainings, discuss likely reasons for this, I could not open up one biomedical idea that would make any sense to that system. I constantly say it's really bad what hasn't been fixed, but the only defense I'll give to the people in the system is they're not doing the right thing, but they don't react to mistakes. For once, they've got to be challenged with the real mistakes, which has turned out to be ignoring viruses I was literally taught about in medical school. What we call herpes-related viruses go to the temporal lobes of the brain. Isn't that interesting? And literally, as I was taught, a child first encounters what we were learning as these higher order herpes viruses, things called HHV6, HHV7, HHV8, in something most parents of those days knew about called roseola. A child would get an extremely high fever. As a pediatrician, loads of calls, worried about a child, reassure a parent, and very classically, the fever would break and a rash would appear on the whole child. Now, what's happened? It's simple to understand. Most of the children today presenting on the spectrum may or may not have a fever. They certainly do not get the rash of roseola. And it's the tip of the iceberg that their immune systems are not handling their encounter with this virus. Now, I might add, when does that happen? In most normal kids, it was 12, 15 to 18 months old, which is also interesting because I was taught in medical school a child's immune system changes twice in life, somewhere in that 12, 15-month range, and again in adolescence. So sadly, frustratingly, many parents will see their child set off by a vaccine, which is supposed to be an immune stimulatory event, but I have yet to meet a family in all these years that can't see where their child was starting to get in trouble long before the vaccines. And it's a mistake, I believe. I don't think what we're doing with vaccines out there is necessarily correct. I think we may be over-vaccinating some children, but vaccines themselves cannot and have never been able to cause a mistake called autism.
I know that, and I'll say Robert Kennedy Jr., I know him by Bobby, believed that it was the MMR vaccine back in the 80s that really, stimulated the diagnosis of autism around the country, really increased it. And, I don't know, I don't have an opinion one way or another, but it kind of falls into your theory that some vaccine has helped stimulate the diagnosis of autism. And then but whether it's that one or other ones or whatever, but you're basically, as I understand what you're saying, in this 12-month to 15-month period when a child's immune system is coming into play, and that they're either going through some type of herpes virus, or they're going through roseola, or they're having some other attack on their body, and that it may be that vaccine or another vaccine or somehow contributes to a diagnosis by a doctor of autism. Am I hearing you right in saying these things? I'm trying to kind of summarize in my own thoughts what you're saying.
Well, one is they're getting labels called autism, which are completely wrong. It does not meet criteria of whatever real autism was. Number two, what the distinction is just like that NIH meeting 1992. I can show the parents their children are already under stress. I can make an argument much more than the vaccines. We have made our food supply toxic. And when children have dark circles, colic, rashes, that is the stresses that's then setting them up for problems. And you go back again to basic medical school teaching. We were not supposed to give vaccines to children when they're ill. And this system refuses to acknowledge many of these children are ill when they're being given those vaccines. Again, I stress I don't myself believe the vaccines cause this problem. I've had many parents, once they start to help their child, go back to a modified vaccine schedule, and that's the next problem. Parents should have a choice. It doesn't mean that all vaccines need to be given the day the child is in an office. I was taught a kid's supposed to be healthy, and what I've always told parents, maybe you get a couple of vaccines. Nothing's been studied that says giving 6 or 8 vaccines at one time is the right idea. And I'll give you far more critical mistake we're making. The MMR, when it sets a kid off, is a matter, I believe, of timing. They were on their way. They get the vaccine at that critical time. But if I was taught in a good medical school, when you give a measles vaccine, 1 out of 20 children don't take. You have roughly a 5% failure rate. So I was very happy when over the years the Academy of Pediatrics said children should get a measles booster, MMR, 10, 11 years old. That's when measles becomes a dangerous disease again. But why is the present system making every kid get a booster at 4 or 5 years old when 95% of those children do not need it? We need to get back to some intelligence in our medical decisions.
Well, I mean, everything that you said to me is not being a scientist or a doctor. It certainly makes common sense based upon what I've seen the statistical evidence show and what I've seen happen, raising my children and seeing middle schools today where they have pill lines that are blocks long for kids to come get their medication that has to do with ADD or ADHD or so forth. So I know that as we sit here today, I'm pretty certain that both the American Academy of Pediatricians as well as the pharmaceutical industry is not really fond of some of your ideas, and they've probably come against you. Am I correct?
Essentially, I have learned over the years, the pharma go where there's money to be made. But I had an interesting experience decades ago meeting with a representative from a major pharmaceutical company, took my information, came back 3-4 months later and said I was making a lot of sense to their scientists, but the discussion was because this is classified inappropriately as a neurodevelopmental disorder. I've lived through the years of medical school that the pharma didn't want to study normal drugs on children because they're children. And when the system classifies these children as neurodevelopmental, no pharma in life is going to take a chance investigating that. What I was exposed to, though, opened the door that this is a major medical illness, and at least some of the pharma are going to be there to help.
Well, you're very polite in your description. As a lawyer of over 40 years, I've always said you follow the money and you learn the truth. And so, we know, I have a biblical worldview, and the Bible says it's not money that's a sin, it's the love of money. And we see what's happening in our nation. We've seen what's happened to corporate world and even to the pharmaceutical industry. And I know you didn't really address the complete vaccine question that is dealt with, what our country's dealt with when COVID was described as a pandemic. I think the jury's probably still out whether or not it was a pandemic or an epidemic or what it was. And so I think that
I'll be happy to jump in there because that's
if we rush to judgment, we have consequences. And I still believe that the jury is, as to use a cliche of a lawyer, the jury's still out on what took place in the last 4 years after the pandemic was declared and mandatory vaccines were issued, and we're still looking at the consequential fallout from that. But you can share your opinion. You know what mine is.
No, look, this is a case where I believe the system by ignoring chronic viruses in adults and children has acted in many ways making mistakes. What I told families over and over, once COVID had a worldwide mortality less than 1%, it was time to wake up and understand COVID wasn't responsible for all this, and yet the people in charge won't do that. It's the same system that's ignoring these viruses in children. I believe you have a lot of adults and children walking around compromised. We'll get to it. I hope that the CDC has lowered developmental milestones on children. But before that, I was learning when patients come in now, if you go to your doctor and get a checkup and the doctor says you're fine, you need to start asking, what was my white count? The labs have inappropriately lowered normal white counts to 3.4, 3.7. Anything below a 4 means that person is walking around compromised, and in my training, that's the person that may get a flu and then can't handle it correctly. The mistakes out there are we have not tried to step back and understand what are we missing. Everyone wants to blame it on COVID, and then kind of in a draconian manner, they okay a vaccine that never passed normal safety inspections, was authorized as an emergency vaccine, and I believe the starting point, hopefully if Robert Kennedy becomes health, education, welfare, is to not give a vaccine to children and adolescents until it is able to pass normal safety inspections, and I doubt it will.
Well, I agree with you, and I pray that we have a change in our administration, and I pray that he's part of the new administration, because I see that there could be a change in the CDC and the NIH and the FDA. That would be a positive. But what we learned is anytime you let big business and government combine their efforts, then we've got a problem. And then we've had a problem for 4 years in this country, and the world, not just the country, but it seemed that other countries were wiser than we were. And we don't need to get into all of those and on how they didn't have the mandates, they didn't enforce the things, they didn't take the vaccines, and their health is fine. And so anyway, it goes back to money. It goes back to money. But so anyway, I mean, these are some real enlightening remarks that you're making, and I really would love to see a turnaround on these diagnoses of autism. I would really, like to see a turnaround on all the medication that's being given to our children. We want to, our children are our future, and we don't need them dumbed down. We don't need them mistreated. We don't need them misdiagnosed. We need them treated well. At the same time, physicians such as yourself need to be allowed to be physicians, and they don't need to be practicing under threatening atmospheres coming from some association because you don't buy into what they believe. And I saw what they did during COVID. I saw what they were trying to do to physicians and doctors that didn't agree with the plan. And today I know for a fact that they're training young cardiologists to just specialize in ablations. Why? Because we know myocarditis was a consequence to giving these they weren't vaccines, to give these shots to young males, and it's even happening to older adults as well. So now you got a new niche. The cardiologist isn't a cardiologist or a cardiovascular surgeon. He's going to specialize in ablations because that's a consequence from the stinking vaccines. And so they know it. And again, it's about following the money. And I don't want to get on my horse about this, but I have some pretty strong convictions. You obviously do. And so let's pray that we see a change, and we pray for our children. We want our next generations to do better and healthier than what we've done, and make wiser decisions than what we made. And so I'm going to let you conclude by giving me your thoughts for the future. Obviously, this neurospec objective test is an important test that all clinicians need to consider, and the early diagnosis to realize that these young people are having immune deficiencies and problems with viruses. and don't need to be diagnosed with autism is really a really important factor for the entire country, the entire state of Louisiana, the entire medical community. So, I mean, but let me give it back to you, because I want to hear what your final words are and what you think needs to happen in this country.
Hunter, that is my prayer. When I have believed when 2% of our children are not labeled autism, and we have to admit that we are losing potentially bright, intelligent children, unfortunately, my frustrations have come to a head by something I think every family in this country needs to understand. After all these years of missing this, not diagnosing real viruses, not correcting the mistakes, what's happened? The CDC has officially lowered childhood developmental milestones, which is so impossible that everybody out there has to understand. No credible CDC medical system would accept a lowering of child developmental milestones without asking why, having to go back and maybe relook at these viruses. And sadly, it has become very obvious, if the present system stays in effect, the present administration, the present CDC, this is a write-off of children. I cannot say that strong enough, and I personally believe they will continue to do it. Nothing will change. I am praying Trump becomes elected, Robert Kennedy gets a chance to be Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and while he has been misled over many years by people he's heard wrong things from, everybody has told me he's a great guy, he means well, and I am hoping with the right places to go after this system, we could finally fix this.
Again, I want to thank the audience for joining in today. I really appreciate Dr. Goldberg. I thank Dr. Elise Goldberg as well for having made the introduction. And we never know what God has in store for us. We just have to be still sometimes and listen. And he does have a quiet voice. And that day I had one from Dr. Elise and got to have this meeting today with Dr. Michael Goldberg. I want to remind the audience, go order this book, The Myth of Autism. Read this. It's very enlightening, and get educated on the subject matter. We need this change in America. As he just said, politically, we need this change, because not only do we need a different person in the White House, we also need a new health of education and welfare. And we hope that that's going to be Bobby Kennedy. And so anytime you see an individual leave the Democratic Party that comes from a historical family of the Kennedy family and go to be independent, then you take a second look. And then when you see that independent endorse a Republican, you take a third look. So I think the country's headed in the right direction if we vote the right way. So I'm encouraging everybody to go vote. Go vote. Don't sit home. There's no one to blame but yourself if you don't vote. Thank you, Dr. Goldberg, and God bless.
Hunter, thank you more than I can say, and I look at every bit of pressure coming to a head the next 3 weeks, so if I can do anything else, help in any way, you've got me, okay? I promise you.
Thank you.
And I thank you for everything you've been doing. This has been, look at, my wife actually, we look at her meeting you as a wonderful thing, God's inspiration. And Hunter, I think you know this, I never would have believed this as a doctor. But I really believe this is a fight between good and evil, and it's time that the good guys won.
Thank you. God bless, and good day.
God bless. You all take care. Thank you so much.